I'm one of the trainers for the Transition Towns movement in the U.S. There are 23 of us, 4 of us east of the Mississippi. And since we've been asked to try not to fly anymore, which is something I had tried once before in my life till my father had a heart attack, and then I ended up flying out to Arizona, but I was kind of excited about trying to do this work without getting on an airplane again. And it's been actually a great deal of fun, although it takes an enormous amount of time to get on the train to go to Pittsburgh compared to going to the airport. But in fact, when I started to add up all the time it takes to go through security and take your shoes off, and you know, it's not that bad, and it's a lot more fun. So the Transition Towns movement is growing very rapidly all over the world. I'm just so honored to be able to share it with you, and I brought some cards that have the main websites. There's a new one, Transition Network, which is the global network of transition initiatives all over the world. And transitionnetwork.org is just come out, and you can go and sign up as an individual. You can sign up your town or community initiative, and you can describe the projects you're doing. And just in the last week or so, I've been going on every few days to see, oh, you know, what's happening. And I cannot believe, you know, Adelaide, Australia, New Zealand, and you know, places in Mexico and places all over Europe. This movement has thousands of communities. In fact, it's so big that we don't really know how big it is. We know that there are over 1,000 communities in the UK that have started the Transition Towns process. We know that we've got several hundred official mullers, that's what they call them, communities that are mulling over joining the Transition Town movement. And those folks get to join the big website too. It's a very flexible, bottom-up, you know, voluntary grassroots movement. I've worked for 28 years in professional capacities in public policy, in social change work, in human rights, in economic justice. I've done environmental racism, toxic chemicals damaging children's health, causing cancer. I've done, you know, a whole range of environmental and national policy issue work. And I was really impressed to see the scale of this movement with no money. But I still wanted to check it out, and went over to the UK last May and June and spent a month volunteering in Totnes, which is the home base of the transition movement in southwest England. And I have to say that these folks are the real humble thing. They are not the big kind of arrogant, we're God, we have the answer and everyone should listen to us. In fact, they've been a little bit overwhelmed by the response to this movement and trying to meet all the needs and demands. And the guy who really got it going, Rob Hopkins, who wrote this book, the Transition Handbook, which I have a few copies today if people want to buy at cost. But this book comes out of his experience as a permaculture teacher, and I'll explain what permaculture is in a few minutes. But Rob doesn't fly anywhere, and he's just a really nice, humble guy, father, and devoted father. He spends weekends at home as much as possible. And he and his colleagues, and there's really a team of them, have put together these resources on a shoestring budget. They just actually got their first major grant from the British government, but they've been operating on almost no money. And when I went to their offices, here's this big international movement, you know, in Brazil and, you know, in Hong Kong and Hungary and all over Europe. And they had this crappy, you know, the most impoverished kind of little office that you would imagine. So there's Rob Hopkins sitting at one broken old desk, and next to him is a desk where the financial accountant works and shares it with the person who runs the schools program, and then the woman who does their urban cities work and their environmental racism work. You know, those two folks share another desk, and then there's the international director, Ben, who, you know, sits in the corner, and then there's one other desk, and they've got a little room downstairs. I mean, it's just, they're really putting their money into the web resources, into nurturing all of the grassroots initiatives around the world. So I will share with you now some slides from the Transition Towns movement in the UK and some additional ones that we've developed here in the US to help explain this movement to you. So the idea is from oil dependence and all fossil fuel dependence, coal and natural gas, to resilience, to community resilience. And we do this resilience work by unleashing the collective genius of the community. Some of you may have heard of research, MIT and other academic institutions, research on the collective genius. And what they basically found is that a group of people who are dedicated to a common purpose, whether it's piling sandbags on the Mississippi River to keep their town from flooding, or feeding the hungry in their community once a month by cooking a meal, that when people come together around a common purpose, the IQ of the group is much higher than the IQ of any one individual. That everything we've been taught about the superior intellectual who guides the community to safety or to, progress or whatever, is really not true. That it's when we all come together and we share a common vision and a goal, that the creativity and our different perspectives, like an ecosystem, are much more sophisticated and insightful than anything we can do alone. Now, that's not to say that there aren't times when individual leadership is really critical, like, a captain of a sinking ship telling everybody where to go to get into life rafts. But if we want to solve complex problems, and if we want to build large consensus around those problems and the solutions, we need to do collective work. We need to talk together, we need to create together. So this movement it has a lot of business consultants in it, and experienced business professionals, as well as educators and psychologists and social workers, and parents, and just all kinds of folks have contributed to this work over the last 6 years. And so the idea is that we come together as a community to address what's called the triple challenge, or the triple crisis of depleting oil and energy and other kinds of resources from the earth, and climate crisis, climate change, and economic instability. This is a web link to some of the transition towns movements. This is actually one of 3 maps, and all 3 of them look like this. As I mentioned, there's over 1,000 communities in the UK that are in some stage of developing the transition movement. And I could show you pictures from all over the world, Australia and the US and all kinds of places where people have been putting their little balloons up. So the Transition Town movement started when Rob was in Ireland in 2004, and he heard some lectures about the triple crisis that we're facing. And he decided that using permaculture, how many of you have heard of permaculture before? Oh, great. Oh, because you're in Tom's class. Oh, great. So, so permanent culture, permanent agriculture. You got to have a community to support the farmers, or you end up with, as Garrison Keillor says, all the Norwegian bachelor farmers out there in the middle of North Dakota trying to raise wheat for everybody and not getting any good companionship in the process. So the idea that we've got to have schools and hospitals and thriving communities to sustain our agricultural system, especially after oil prices go up. Some of you may know Richard Heinberg's work, who wrote The Party's Over, about the decline of oil, and he wrote another book called Peak Everything that looks at how we're facing all kinds of deterioration in access to resources. For example, we've been running a lot of our agriculture by supplementing our fields with phosphorus that's mined from an island out in the Pacific. And that supply of phosphorus isn't going to last forever. I did some work with the Sustainability Institute, which is a think tank that was founded by Donella Meadows, who wrote Limits to Growth back in the 70s. It was the first book to really look at what happens if you keep taking out, extracting minerals, extracting fresh water, using land up and having topsoil run down the riverbeds and leave your agricultural region. What happens if you keep doing this and growing your population and using up all that cheap energy? Eventually you run into a whole series of pollution problems, illness problems, and real population collapse and risk. And so Donella's think tank, the Sustainability Institute, they always say, if it wasn't peak oil, it'd be peak water, it'd be peak farmland, that we are just so over expanding beyond what's sustainable. I heard a really good analogy about this recently. It's as if we're living on the 10th floor of a brick high-rise, and we're going down every day and pulling 10 or 20 or 30 bricks out from the lower floors and carrying them up to the top and building our high-rise higher and higher. You know, there's only so long that you can keep doing that you can keep mining the resource base and growing exponentially, growing your economy, growing your consumption. More and more people flying on airplanes, more and more people buying exotic products. Eventually, the bricks that you have withdrawn from your base are going to cause the weakening of your whole structure. And you don't necessarily see it because it affects the economy. It affects us all in all these fundamental ways. So back to the positive stuff. The Transition Network is all these people. This is just a few of the volunteers in the UK. People who have just given untold countless hours to support and grow this big global movement. So why has the transition movement emerged? I'm going to just briefly, I know you've studied some of this now, and just to talk about the triple challenge a bit. Peak oil, global warming, and economic instability, which James Howard Kunstler calls the long emergency, that we're entering this totally different time period than what we've known. So the end of cheap oil and natural gas. This is a graph from the international body that collects statistics about energy and other economic matters, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is Europe, the US, Japan, Canada, all the industrialized wealthy countries. And it was pretty exciting in 2008 when they came out and printed this graph in their annual World Energy Outlook, which is a report on energy supplies around the world, where they see that blue mark that's showing how we're declining and oil supplies in all the discovered, currently producing oil fields in the world. So basically, they were finally coming out and really saying to the world, we're seeing a decline in all the producing oil fields, which are the easy to get oil. The oil that we're getting out of Saudi Arabia, that's all the low cost, really energy inexpensive way of getting fossil fuels. Now the light blue, fields yet to be developed. That's where we've discovered, but we don't know how much is there. So anybody's guess as to what's really in that light blue category. Orange is my favorite category, fields yet to be found. But that's where the geologic conditions are such that we think there might be some liquid fuels there, but nobody knows for sure, like under the deep ocean. Now the yellow is natural gas liquids, and there's a big debate about whether the peak in natural gas production may be coming even faster than oil. And the non-conventional oil, that green, that's all the tar sands and oil shales, the really nasty stuff that, well, let's trash our environment completely so we have no clean water and we can't grow anything or raise any beef cattle. Let's just destroy all living things so that we can get a little bit of oil to burn in our cars right now. That's what that represents. So, you've seen these kind of graphs. This one shows that there are 3 potential peaks that when we look back historically, we may see that peak actually happened in 2005 a couple of times. What many folks think is that we've gotten more and more efficient at pulling the oil out of the ground. So when we do hit the decline, it's going to happen a lot faster. I was talking to Chris Martenson, who some of you may know. He's joined Transition Montague. He's the guy who does Crash Course about economic instability. And he said the latest thing he heard in his recent tour in Europe is maybe 9% decline in supplies once we get past this sort of efficiency splurge that we've got right now. But this graph shows January 2002 to September 2012, and you can see that we are heavy duty in the period that everybody's been predicting that we are in decline in the world's major oil fields. Here's just another graph from theoildrum.com. If you get into this stuff, you can check out theoildrum.com. But that yellow band represents sort of the average. All those little tiny gray lines represent different think tanks and oil companies and experts, all the people who really study this, and vote Republican, or who, were advisors to the Bush administration. All those folks are in there. And their mean prediction is that we're right at the peak. We're right at the crest. Now the good news, in a way, is that because of the Depression, the amount of oil consumed has dropped. about 9%, according to Lester Brown of World Watch Institute. And that means that the price has remained stable, and that gives us an extra window of time to get our homes weatherized, start shifting away from our dependence on oil. But we have to move really quickly. I mean, this is right on our back. Chris Martenson said the latest predictions are that we've got 1 to 3 years. Now, maybe this global depression is going to continue to unfold, and so the prices are not going to go up as rapidly as people had thought. But, you know, it's just a really tricky time. So in history, we're going to look back and see this petroleum interval as this little tiny blip on the screen. In the left column there is the birth of Christ. And, you know, in 2,000 years, and people didn't really have access to cheap fossil fuels, but we've become so dependent upon it. In fact, you know, we've been trying to figure out, is there anything that we do that doesn't involve oil or natural gas? The only thing I've heard so far that's persuasive is a young teenager who said, well, in the summer, I know about, you know, edible local plants in the forest in my backyard. So if I don't wear any clothes or shoes and I go out into the forest and harvest those edibles, that's not using any oil or natural gas. So that's a pretty good example. But not necessarily very practical for most of us. So this is the Bush administration, the Hirsch report. And we've never faced a problem like this, you know, the peaking of oil, without massive mitigation or action. The problem will be pervasive all through our economy, all through our lives, and not temporary. Previous energy transitions, like from wood to coal or coal to oil, were gradual and evolutionary. Oil peaking is going to be abrupt, and it's going to ripple through our economy, ripple through our lives. Food costs go up, all kinds of impacts. And we thought, well, you know, some people have said, well, we just turn coal into gas and solve all our problems. But, you know, studies suggest that we're going to reach the maximum of coal production in 15 to 20 years. So even if it wasn't causing global warming in such a serious way, coal is the worst culprit in global warming. It's not going to be a long-term solution. So we really have to shift. And just a couple of words about the climate crisis. It is really, really bad. It's really bad. I've just been reading Tim Flannery, his latest book, Now or Never, which is that we have a few years to really make this happen. He says the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is very conservative. They're the 2,000 plus scientists that have been studying all the data, the top climate scientists, not the guys that get hired by Shell and Exxon to kind of, you know, there's 12 guys that have been hired since the 90s, you know, to be propagandists. But in fact, you know, the 2,700 scientists came out last summer and joined the U.S. Army and the World Bank and the UN, an unlikely cast of collaborators to warn that we're facing the collapse of civilization. The U.S. Army and all these retired admirals, you know, they're seeing it in the oceans. They're seeing it everywhere. Farmers all over the world are seeing it. We're seeing it in the climatic weather. You know, the prediction for global warming is that we get more rain in New England, as well as more extremes of drought and rain and ice storms and heat in January. Turns out that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projections are way too conservative, and that's why they keep missing the boat. That's why they predicted a small amount of gradual change that maybe will affect our grandchildren. No, it's happening now. It's affecting food supplies now, and the latest assessment is that we've got the real task is 4 times greater than what the IPCC has been saying. And that was assuming that we can survive at 500 parts per million of carbon dioxide, which in fact, you know, the latest science, James Hansen and others, says we've got to get below 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and we're at 390 and rising rapidly. So if you look in historical time, this graph kind of says it all. The purple line in the middle is the average global temperature over the last 10,000 years of human civilization. So that purple band represents 1 degree Celsius of fluctuation in global temperature. That's 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And that band is everything we've ever known in agriculture, in civilization, in writing, in cities. Prior to that, we were hunter-gatherers. Prior to 10,000 years ago, we were hunter-gatherers. We had a very small population, and there were ice ages. And if you go back, 12, 14,000 years, in this area we had a mile of ice above our heads. So 4 degrees in lower temperature, 4 degrees means a mile of ice, 4 degrees Celsius. The IPCC says we're looking at least 4 degrees. MIT says we could go up to 7 degrees. We could go from 180 parts per million carbon dioxide, Industrial Revolution 280 parts per million. We're at 390. We could get 950 with runaway global warming. We are outside the range, in terms of our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and methane levels, we are outside the range of how human beings have lived for the last 10,000 years. Everything, the medieval warming, the little ice age that all the skeptics tried to point to and say, hey, global warming isn't happening, those are all within that 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degree Fahrenheit fluctuation range. So we are now looking at this, what we've basically done is we're taking all the carbon from the dinosaur era, fossil fuels, we're digging it up, we're burning it really rapidly. That's causing this huge accumulation of warming, which is disrupting all the weather patterns. So you get more snow in some areas, there's all this effects on the oceans, and we're now facing this critical moment where if we don't take strong action, we are going to end up with a world that is uninhabitable for many people. Most people. I mean, some of the dire predictions are that we could lose 90% of the world's population. We could lose over 2/3 of the world's species. And even worse, So there's this runaway warming phenomenon. And I'll just give you one example. What's the big deal about ice? Well, it turns out that the ice at the North Pole plays a whole bunch of functions. It helps regulate temperature. It helps keep our agricultural system functioning, because of the way that water and climate, weather patterns move around the Earth. And it also reflects sunlight back to outer space. White reflects the sunlight back out. That means it keeps the Earth cooler. If we melt the ice, then the oceans at the North Pole will absorb more and more heat, which means more ice melts, which means more melting. And that's what happened in 2007. All of a sudden, all of our predictions about how much ice we were losing and how long it would take for there to be any serious impact were completely out the window. The experts were shocked. They're watching the disintegration of this system that has reflected the sunlight back to outer space, and we're seeing measurable changes in ocean temperatures all over the world with impacts on all the species, all of the fish species, and I'm not even going to go into it all. You all know it's incredibly depressing, and the impacts on human beings are huge. We're looking at loss of water supplies for 1/5 of the world's population, 1.3 billion people. They're drinking water, their agricultural water. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to move? That's why the U.S. Army says we're looking at half the world's nations being destabilized by 2050 if we don't take really strong action and prevent all of these climatic features from being lost. So the 190 of the world's largest cities will be flooded with a modest level of warming. So we've got a huge problem. We've got to get back down. We know how to do a lot of it, and I'll talk about this more at the end. But basically, we have to get the carbon out of the atmosphere, resequestered in the soils by returning to old-fashioned forms of agriculture. We've got to plant trees. We've got to stop cutting down our trees. We've got to hold all the carbon in plant life that we can, because that's, plants take carbon out of the air. That's how they grow. They literally pull carbon out of the air. So we've got to be planting everything we can and not cutting things down for like biomass plants, things like that. So economic instability, you all read the newspapers. We've got a lot of problems in store. I'll just tell you a couple of stories. After I left DC and moved up here, I really wanted to understand people's relationship to consumption and to money. So I became a part-time financial counselor for a nonprofit organization. So for about 3 years, I part-time met with people and talked to them about budgets, because my mother's from the farm and she taught me how to be very frugal, and my family grew up poor when my dad lost his job at one point. So I knew about Depression-era living, so I just taught all these people how to budget. And one of the fascinating things I learned is that most people were borrowing against all their assets. And I talked to some of the old guys in this nonprofit, retired bankers, a retired college professor, a retired CEO from the Springfield area, and they said, oh yeah. And they said, all the people who remember the crash of 1929 and all the people who learned from them are retired. By the mid-90s, these people were pretty much out of the workforce. And the old guys said, who were retiring and doing this financial counseling as a service to the community, they said, the young Turks coming up, they think they're so clever with all their derivatives and all their market mechanisms and, all the whole mortgage industry. They're persuading people to borrow against their home. You know, instead of seeing your home as a place to live, they're getting people to think of it as a cash cow to finance a lifestyle. And so, and I remember, because I used to say to people, you can't afford to be in that house. Look at the numbers. If you want to do all these other things, you know, or you can't do. And they would say, but everybody is doing this. My real estate agent tells me, the bank tells me I can afford this loan. There was this huge growth in everybody's idea that they could sort of keep growing, when in fact real wages started falling in the mid-70s. How many of you know this? Real wages for the average American worker, 85% of us, have been falling since 1974.
But not the executive community.
No. The gap between rich and poor. The gap between the highest paid and lowest paid. So we're all being taught that every generation should do better than the last. But in fact, for over 30 years, most of us have been doing worse. Healthcare costs, education costs, and now we're going to see the cost of energy, food, and all these others. So we were just hanging on, most of us anyway, and all these structural problems of indebtedness we're doing the same thing in our government as we have been in our own homes and businesses. And so all of this is combined with the fact that we've got an empire. We in the US are in particular trouble because this has been our empire moment. And there's a guy named Paul Kennedy, a historian, British historian, who wrote a book in 1987, was this big popular book with all people from all political stripes. And he talked about how great powers in the last 500 years have this tendency to try to hold on to power. And they end up bankrupting their economies. They overstretch, and then they end up crashing their economies. Think about all those British movies, you know. Think about what happened to the Dutch. You know, they used to be the world power. So did Portugal. But there's this big collapse that happens when nations try to hold on to this top dog position. He says, if too large a portion of the nation's resources is diverted from, you know, the well-being of the population, and allocated instead to military purposes, it's likely to lead to a weakening of national power of the long term. So this is a guy who was actually trying to warn the US to not do the same stupid thing that Britain had done and overshoot and collapse. In the same way, if a nation overextends itself strategically by, say, the conquest of extensive territories or the waging of costly wars, nothing familiar here, it runs the risk that the potential benefits from external expansion may be outweighed by the great financial expense of it all. A dilemma which becomes acute if the nation concerned has entered a period of relative economic decline. So basically, we've got a structural problem that no single president can fix. We've got to reassess our whole funding priorities, and there's not a lot of work that's happening around that. And this is me, and maybe some of you, all of us. You know, I figure I've been through 3 cycles of denial, where I just don't want to deal with this. It's too much. Here we all are. This is me, actually. I was a big disco fan. Still am, I have to admit. But we're on this kind of Titanic where, you know, the technologists and the whole system, right? It can't be that flawed. It can't be that messed up. We can't be headed into anything really bad. And I also think of all my high school buddies out there who've never been lucky enough to hear about this kind of information. Things that you guys take for granted. Most of my relatives and friends back in the Midwest really haven't heard much about except for me. And you know, how all these folks are going to be victimized. You know, all of them are already suffering because of all these huge forces. So as we look at this point in time, the transition movement says, all right, we've got our pre-industrial, relatively sustainable hunter-gatherer village life. And 10,000 years before petroleum, we managed to keep most of things functioning pretty well. But then with the Industrial Revolution, we saw a massive increase in energy extraction, resource extraction, population explosion, and pollution and waste generation. So now we have all this toxic waste and pollution on top of the problems of extracting. But this has been called modernism, and that we're ascending up. We've been talking about, well, maybe actually this was digging a hole. Maybe it was actually going the other way. And instead of a climax, we're actually starting to hit bottom. And the question is, what are we going to do? We've got this moment. The climate scientists say we have to act now. We know that peak oil is coming very quickly. We need to act on that. We know that the resource extraction is more than can be sustained. So there's sort of 4 options that people talk about. The techno-fantasy. And if you have relatives in that, oh, you know, algae will save us. Biodiesel will save us. You know, we can just keep kind of, you know, doing everything and we'll have a miracle cure. Then there's the green tech stability, which I have been a big fan of, I confess. If we just buy, you know, Prius and buy organic vegetables and more of us, you know, take the bus a couple of times a year, change a few light bulbs, we'll all be fine. And then there's the Earth stewardship approach, which says, nope, we have a bigger problem than that. We've got all of these multiple problems coming together. And then there's the Mad Max scenario. Y'all know Mad Max, the movie about the desert and the fight. Everybody's nasty, brutish, and, you know, and competitive over scarce water and oil supplies. Notice that Mad Max happens when you try to pursue that techno-fantasy a little too far, and then you really crash and burn because you missed your chance to grab the ring, the brass ring on the merry-go-round. You know, you keep going in the direction and not, and there are a lot of societies that made that mistake. We know about Easter Island. They got into their little worldview, into their mindset, their ideology, and it became a big groupthink. But there are other societies that had, you know, the kid who says the emperor has no clothes. Other societies with people like some of you who raise questions and think independently and start saying, even when it's not popular, wait a minute, do we really want to head towards that iceberg? Or there might be icebergs out here. Maybe we should like start changing direction a little bit. And it feels uncomfortable to do that, but in fact that's a survival instinct. That's what helps societies and human beings function and survive and get through difficulties and actually come out. So the creative descent approach is the transition towns approach. And the idea is we're going to have to transition anyway. We might as well have fun. Like, why not learn how to ride that slope? You know, hang 10 instead of, you know, overreaching and trying to do too much and crashing and burning. Vandana Shiva is a famous scientist from India, and she says the uncertainty of our times is no reason to be certain about hopelessness. People have been dealing with scrapes like this for how many? 10,000 years? You know, we've had all kinds of problems. We're very clever, and we get ourselves into these messes. And some societies have figured out how to get beyond it, and others have given up or turned a blind eye and ended up struggling. So, you know, and the Bible and all of our religious traditions are filled with these stories to try to teach us to think, to ask questions, and to put our trust in the good, in what's right, and in taking care of the community, not in selfish pursuits or in trying to be God. All the world's traditions have within them the seeds of this wisdom to help our societies continue to function, and that's what we have to do now. All things are possible once enough human beings realize that everything's at stake. Norman Cousins. So how do we do this? Rob Hopkins comes along, he says, well, actually a lower energy, more localized future would be better. I mean, think about it. And we spend some time doing this in our workshops. We do a weekend training to teach people the whole process. But if we shift from being consumers only and the endless rat race trying to find satisfaction in buying the perfect item at the mall, to being producer consumers where we have relationships in our communities and we are valued for what we give and contribute and other people contribute to us, where we don't have to do all the lousy jobs we hate. So the transition movement rests on 4 recognitions. Life with less energy is inevitable, and it's better to plan than to crash. We've lost the resilience that our grandparents and great-grandparents had. My mother not only knew how to cook a chicken, she knew how to kill it, pluck it, prepare it, because she grew up on a farm. She knows how to can everything. She knows how to sew and repair any article of clothing. I can do blueberry jam and tomatoes. I can cook a little bit, but I don't have the same skills and abilities. And so part of transition is all about the great reskilling. Oh, so we have to act for ourselves, and we have to act now. We can't wait. Nobody's going to rescue us. We have to rebuild our communities and do this. And by unleashing our collective genius and all the different skills and abilities that people have, we're going to not only solve this problem, but we're going to have a good time and a more enriching, positive life. How people live for 2 million years. Human beings are unbelievably amazing. And if you spend all your time out in nature, you know what's going on. If your survival depends on it, you know how to read the weather, 20 different names for snow like the Eskimos have. People are very creative. And the problem is that we've lost our connection and our knowledge of how to work with the system. We've gotten in this worldview that we can be in charge, we can control things. And now we've gotten into a mess. And we have to hurry up and relearn how to live in ways that are functional and sustainable. The research is showing, and maybe you've read some about this, that people don't do very well when they're not in nature. People, all these kids from the city that they take out, at first they freak out because there aren't street lights. But once they start to get into it, it's very healing. Nature doesn't judge. Nature just is. Nature challenges you without putting you down. It's a very healing, restorative. We actually, the neurological makeup of human beings, and it makes sense, right? We're creatures, we're species that lived for 2 million years. We evolved outside. So it makes sense that that's where we would get fed at a very basic biological, neurological level. Okay, so how does the transition movement do this? It kind of boils down, if you have to boil it down to a simple question that you take around your community. How are we going to rebuild our resilience, our economic resilience, our community resilience, while reducing our use of fossil fuels, our dependence on fossil fuels that are not going to last forever? Uranium is not going to last forever. All these, the forests, if everybody burns forests to produce electricity and heat, and everything, we're not going to have forests. So how can we do all this and yet have a positive, fulfilling life? And the answers are a lot of community building, a lot of reskilling. I'm going to show you a few photographs, images of experiences in the UK and in Northern Europe where the transition movement is taking off. And then show you some pictures of the 12 steps that Rob describes in the book that help you get your community going. So this is one of the gardening groups in the UK. The guy on the right is a dentist who let me stay in his house for free because I was volunteering for the movement. I didn't need any money then, because of all these people taking care of me. She's a retired social worker. He's a computer geek. He's a corporate trainer who now trains for the transition movement, and his wife. And Lou, who works in the office and sings to you when you come to the front door. Hello, how are you? They really have a good time together. All over the UK and all over Europe, just like in this country, there's a massive urban gardening, community gardening movement. And in the UK, there's a law that if you want to garden and don't own land, the town you live in has to buy land so that you can garden. Imagine it, the right to grow food. Wouldn't that be unbelievable? They did a project in Totnes. This is in Totnes. They did a project where they said, oh, we have all these old people and people who own homes and land, and we have all these people who are living in apartments and want to garden. And the town is having a hard time coming up with the money to buy all the land, and people want to get out there and start gardening. Well, let's just match these folks up. They had a 7% increase in local food production in one summer at no cost. And all these old people made connections with young people who helped them around their house. And the friendships that developed. It was such a fantastically successful model that now the British government is promoting it all over the country. All over UK and Europe, everybody's taking all these are all railroad pictures taken from railroad vantage points because they're reclaiming all the extra parcels of land so that people can start growing food. And they're growing greenery everywhere because of the beauty that it creates and it soaks up the carbon. I think we should have a new rite of passage in this country that, because every society always had rites of passage to recognize when you become an adult. Like in this country, how do you know when you become an adult? So we need new ways of bringing people in. Well, my favorite lately is all the 12 to 13-year-olds every 2 years go out and get milk from the local farmer, make milk paint, learn how to make milk paint, and then go and paint the rooftops like they're white to reflect sunlight back to outer space. Especially important in North America. You know, that we can come up with a lot of clever ways. We may lose some ice, but who says we can't have white surfaces? That's where the collective genius comes in. And we can turn it into a ritual, like all the societies throughout history have taken everything that's essential to survival and turned it into a festival or a ritual or a song or a story or art. Totem poles. All of the lessons that society needs get turned into art. And that's where the collective genius comes in, where the artists come in, where all of our creativity is needed. All across Europe, bicycles everywhere. This is in Belgium. It's a train station at a bus depot, a cab station, pedestrian walkways all over the town, and bicycle storage all over Europe. People of all ages riding bicycles. They're having a big bicycle revival. It's starting to happen in a few cities in the US as well. And bicycle parking lots at every rail station all over Northern Europe. Bicycle lots, it's so convenient. And they're putting wind turbines everywhere, including next to their coal plants. Nobody complains about that. All the buildings that can, growing plants everywhere, just pulling that carbon right out of the air. In the UK, they've made a commitment to weatherize every home in the country. We can do that too. So the Transition Town process pulls all these kinds of ideas together in a package that really works. And as somebody who's done community organizing for years, when I saw it, I said, this is really smart. I won't go into explaining all the details of why it's so clever. I do have some of these books, and also we'll do the 2-day training again in June in this area if anybody's interested in learning how to do this. But the Transition Town Totnes process looks a lot like this. It's people getting together and thinking and creating and coming up with plans in lots of small groups. You set up an initiating group, and it plans its demise because its job is to invite everyone in the community into the conversation. Reach out to all sectors of the community and invite them in. You do awareness raising, usually 6 months to 12 months. Some communities have done it for longer. You partner with existing organizations because they're already doing a lot of this work. That means you're 5 or 10 years faster down the road. We've got the Northeast Organic Farming Association, we've got CISA, the community involved in sustaining agriculture, we've got Co-op Power, we've got all these PV installers, all kinds of folks that are out there that can help us. You bring everybody together in what you call the great unleashing of everyone's creativity. In Sandpoint, Idaho, they have 500 people. They just couldn't believe it. They'd been doing their outreach for about 1.5 years, and then all of a sudden, they opened the doors the day of the Great Unleashing to officially launch Transition Sandpoint, and 500 people show up. So that's the big event where it's the historic launch of your effort as a community to rebuild your resilience and to come together to creatively do everything for yourselves that you can and not be so dependent on outside forces and outside sources of energy and resources. You translate all that interest and excitement into working groups. These are the classic categories, but you can make any kind of working group you want. When I was in the UK, Transition Exmouth, a little town on the coast, they had their Great Unleashing, and I went and so all these working groups emerged. Bicycle repair working groups, canning working groups. How can we increase local food storage? How can we build more root cellars in neighborhoods? How can we, all the practical things that people used to know how to do. And then you do, in your transition initiative, all kinds of practical projects. In Totnes, they used to be the walnut capital of Britain, and that woman in pink is the mayor with all the regalia, the old regalia. And that's Rob Hopkins in brown. This project, all the old people loved. People had so much fun replanting trees. In fact, the whole movement really took off in the UK because of getting all the old people who remember World War II and the Depression together with all the young people and reviving all these old things. This is their currency from 917, the Totnes pound, which is too big to fit into anybody's wallet, so they had to shrink it. But it's been a great way for local businesses and local citizens to have their own local economy where goods and services get exchanged, and you don't have to actually have the conventional kind of job to get a lot of your needs met. They said it didn't really fly with 25 businesses, but once they got to 65 businesses participating, it took off. This is just one little piece of how you can rebuild your local economy. And when we give the Economic Resilience Workshop, we go into all the details. And we have the Valley Time Trade, which is really picking up in our area. Valley Time Trade is my hour is worth your hour versus somebody else's hour. And you can actually track your hours on the web, and people then exchange and do things for each other. So the oil vulnerability auditing was a program that they offered businesses to help them think about their vulnerability to rising oil costs, and they partnered with a local university to provide the economics expertise, and they connected with local government, which has a lot of resources and can support. So facilitating the great reskilling, people having a lot of fun teaching all kinds of things to each other and learning how to do things locally. And another part of the process is really learning from elders, honoring and appreciating all that they know, and they are fantastic sources of information. And if you honor the elders and their wisdom, they teach you quite a lot about how the town used to be and how the relationships used to work. Like, we didn't know, we had 5 dairy farms in Montague not that long ago. There are none now. And the dairy farmer told us he's losing $1 for every gallon of milk he produces. So this is, we have a lot of work to do to hold on to what we've got and not let it deteriorate and rebuild. So the whole project is about everybody doing what they want to do. It's all driven by passion. So it's like we learn about the climate crisis, we learn about peak oil, it's all really scary and horrible. And then we have fun. We play. I like to cook, so I'm cooking for the electrician, and he's fixing the wiring for some old people's homes so that they can get their buildings insulated. Because there's support and funding to help them get their homes audited, but not for repairing the electrical system. And they can't afford it, and there's not enough money. And the electrician has a downtime right now and needs some extra cash. And so then the minister of the church said, well, why don't we do a fundraiser to raise money for people who really can't pay even at half price for electrical work? And meanwhile, I'm feeding this electrician. And that's how, that's how it used to be. And that's how we can strengthen ourselves and solve a lot of our problems. So the last step in this process, step 12, is about creating a vision and a plan for the community. And this is not going to be the end of everything, but for now, it's where the movement has come to, that the whole community wants to create a vision and a 20-year plan for how it's going to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels. And you do this through all the working groups that I mentioned, which can be about anything, and are tailored to your own unique community. So Turner's Falls is going to have a different vision than Whately is. And so this process is very much about local people envisioning their own way forward into the future. And 20 years is really a perfect time frame. It's one generation. Most of the people who will be involved in the vision and planning process in all these working groups can expect that they might be alive in the next 20 years. And yet it's not too far down the road, not so big that it feels kind of amorphous. And it also is big enough period of time for you to really think about addressing these fundamental problems. Okay, let's really rethink our housing stock. Let's think about long-term transportation. All right, we need to rebuild our rail lines like we had 100 years ago. And how are we going to power them? Well, wind turbines. Off the Cape, off the coast, is going to provide tremendous electricity. But also onshore wind could provide tremendous electricity. We could supplement that with photovoltaic panels. We could supplement it with hydrogen fuel cells, storing. We could have mini plug-in electric vehicles that could serve as backup storage units for all this electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And so you begin to think about all the practical steps to move forward. Envisioning the positive future is all about helping people move from the kind of negative defeatist mindset, which is really rampant. It's like people go from unawareness to fear and panic to despair. And what we know now from neurological studies and from research about how human beings function is if people don't have hope, if they don't have a positive vision, they're actually less intelligent and less socially skilled. That literally if you get afraid or panic or depressed, your ability to solve problems, to connect with other people, and to function deteriorates. So we actually need to consciously choose hope and positive action, even if we're feeling hopeless. Because if we don't act as if something good is possible, it won't happen, right? Self-fulfilling prophecy. We have to act positively to have any chance of solving our problems. If we sit there and try to prognosticate and predict, and if we get cynical and say, oh, it's all going to be terrible, it's all going to fall apart, that's what's going to happen. Because we won't be creatively coming together to do what we can do. And what I realized when I left DC and the global warming crisis was really, I just had so much despair about that. And I thought, I'm not God. I don't know what's going to happen. People are really creative. The Berlin Wall came down, South Africa got rid of apartheid. Women got the right to vote. Who am I to say that we can't turn this around? And then when the milk paint idea of painting rooftops white, I thought, that's it. If we think that we cannot solve this problem, we will not solve the problem. But if we choose to do whatever we can in the most positive ways possible, who knows? We're going to definitely make it a lot better. And we might actually be able to shift the boat away from the iceberg. That's what we're in the business now of saving lives. Everything we do is going to save lives. Everything is going to save people from dying. That's the situation we're in. So the question is just, how many lives are we going to save? How many species are we going to save? How many landscapes are we going to save? That's the question, not whether, not some kind of black and white, like it's either going to be great or it's going to be terrible. It's either we're going to have a happy, carefree life or it's going to suck. That's not the options. It's how much of the good life are we going to have? How much are we going to save? And that's where the positive unleashing of our collective creativity is so critical. So that's what this whole movement is all about. It's people choosing to have fun. And this is a picture of a few of the people at the national conference in the UK. They had us for Saturday night entertainment. We created an energy descent action plan, which you would think would be really boring. I thought it would be really boring. I couldn't imagine what was going to happen. They got us all in groups. We all moved up and chose which topic group, working group we wanted to be a part of. And then we all sat around and brainstormed, what's our positive vision? It was so much fun. And we all put it together in a big book and celebrated all these creative ideas. It was just very inspiring to hear hundreds of ideas, that had come out of this group in 20 minutes. 450 people and hundreds of ideas 20 minutes later of how we could have a great community, great world. And then we put it all together in a big book. These were all big pieces of cardboard, and then we had cake and candles and sang songs. It was a lot of fun, just very playful, and people that's the kind of movement this is. It's like, they say it's more like a party than a protest. It's more like a community potluck than a seminar on global warming. We talk about the crisis because we want to look straight in the eye of the problems we face. We're not going to sugarcoat it. People in this movement agree that we have to know how bad it is or we're not going to design well. Just like if you're looking at a piece of land, you've got to see where the water is and see if it's in a drought area, and then you can design more effectively. So that's what this is about, is let's face everything squarely, and then let's choose positive hope and optimism. Let's look at the emotions that come up for us as we try to change, so it's an inner transition as well as outer. Let's create a vision of an abundant future. Let's do practical, concrete things, because most people are not going to sit in a seminar hall. You guys are, the well-educated and the thoughtful to pick a sustainability course and commit hours of your life to learning about all this stuff. But most people, as you know, in your family, your neighbors, they probably wouldn't come and sit in a seminar. In this process, they don't need to, because we get everybody involved in the practical, hands-on, creative fun. It's festivals, it's party. A great example, Transition Montpelier is now planning their second community building convergence, 5 days in the summer, where all the construction projects in the town, in Montpelier, that people have on their lists, instead of a few hardy volunteers going out and building the park bench or, you know, repairing whatever at the schoolyard, they've made a list of all kinds of construction projects that need to get done. And for 5 days, they have a big happening, a party with potlucks at night and music. The whole community comes and they work together. In Cambridgeport, in a transition movement there, some of you may have heard of their barn raisings. People show up to help weatherize each other's homes. So instead of doing all that boring work by yourself, you now have 20 people or 30 people show up at your house. You buy the materials, and in a day, they get all kinds of air sealing, heat leak, caulking, insulating work done for you. And then you go and do it at somebody else's house. And then they have people who just like to do this and show up, you know, just to help out. They had one weekend, over 100 people showed up. They said, oh my God, what are we going to do? But people keep coming back. So when you do outreach and awareness raising in the early stages, that initiating group, you find a handful of people who are supportive of this, really get it. And they're like the leavening in the bread. So you don't have to have everybody be involved. You don't have to have meetings of 500 people. You just need one meeting of 200 or 500 people that you build up to. And then you have all these folks that are, you know, they have networks, they are organizational leaders, they run the bakery like in, you know, Turners Falls, 2nd Street Bakery. That's a real hub of connection. I just met a guy who had a landscaping business and has lived in Turners Falls for 60 years. He's going to come do a panel with Chris Martenson on economic resilience. What are the principles from the old-fashioned, you know, farm days of how to run a business and keep it sustainable, with Chris talking about the vulnerability of the dollar and our current economic situation. So the solution is small and local, and it's decentralized decision making. There isn't some, you know, committee that has to approve everything. We do have principles. We have values like inclusion and avoiding top-down and avoiding hierarchy, and needs to be a positive, proactive activity. It can't be critical and negative. And so principles to help us rebuild our relationships with each other, even when we have different political views or policy perspectives on nuclear power, whatever it might be. But as a community, we come together. I saw this in action when I was in Totnes. They were working on their Energy Descent Action Plan. And one day I came in, and one of the little spaces that I usually was setting up my computer, there were 3 people there, and one of them was a retired nuclear utility executive, and another had been in the oil industry or the natural gas industry. And they were being interviewed, asked what their advice would be about how to build a more resilient energy system. So even though the transition movement is trying to get away from natural gas and oil and nuclear power and become more locally self-reliant, these guys knew a lot about the grid, about energy, consumer process. They just knew a tremendous amount about the community and energy, and so they were drawn on as experts. So that's the kind of solution. This is Transition Exmouth at their Great Unleashing, just people having a great time. And the woman in red and her brother, who's over on the far left with the beard, they're from Iran. They'd been in the UK for 12 years. They'd come as young people, children, and they said the transition movement was the first place that they felt they really belonged in the UK. The UK is behind us in terms of welcoming diversity. We have a long way to go with racism and you know, stratification and rich and poor. In our country, it's gotten worse in some cases, but in the UK, they're really dealing with immigration issues, and there's a lot of skinheads and really nasty stuff, Nazi-type racism. And they felt that the community feel and the inclusiveness and the respect. It's not that everybody always agrees or likes each other. It's just we all live in this place, and we all want to have a resilient community, so we come together. This is 46 people in Binghamton, an industrial town that's really struggling economically, who all came to the weekend training. In Putney, they've had over 200 people come and be involved. We had 85 people show up for a talk I gave there. This is an example of a working group in Pittsburgh. Some of the young eco-entrepreneurs with some of the peace nicks with, you know, a guy who inherited money from a wealthy family, and just all kinds of different, a couple of poverty-stricken artists. They're just amazing diversity of folks, and we actually, not in this picture, but connected with these African-American entrepreneurs. This is another example up in Vermont of what it looks like to do some of the processes. We had a whole building filled with small groups like this. So this just, I have so many more pictures and I haven't got them all here, but that's enough to give you a flavor of what this movement is all about.